My name is Sarah Bjorkness, and I'm going to be chairing the forum tonight, and Vancouver organizer with the War Resister Support Campaign. And the organizers asked me just to give you a little update on the War Resister issue. That is certainly a worker issue. Just this week, yesterday and today, 2 more war resistors have received voluntary departure dates, deportation orders for October the 28th and October the 30th. So the Conservative government continues to ignore the fact that Parliament voted on June the 3rd to allow war resistors to stay and to immediately halt the deportations of war resistors. And the courts, over the summer, with the dramatic exception of the deportation of Robin Long, the courts have been making decisions in favor of the war resistors, questioning the actions of the Immigration and Refugee Board. So 2 other war resistors who've received deportation dates have been allowed to appeal their pre-removal risk assessment and humanitarian compassionate grounds decisions that went against them. And in the case of Joshua Key, the court ordered the Immigration and Refugee Board to rehear his case with a different board member. So Stephen Harper and the Conservatives are firmly in the minority on this issue, and yet they are bullishly plowing ahead trying to deport war resistors. So that's where we stand on that issue. And Dave is going to go first. Dave is on the coordinating committee of stopwar.ca, and he edits the news and information blog for Stop War.
Thanks, Sarah. So in Afghanistan, 2008 has been a year where 577 civilians have been killed by us, by the U.S., NATO forces, and Afghan government forces, while 800 civilians or so have been killed so far by Taliban and other anti-government militia. Hizb-e-Islami is one of the main other ones. Also in 2008, significantly, the Afghan population turned against the government we're propping up and against the foreign occupation of their country. This is becoming more and more obvious, and I'll get to that. Meanwhile, the leading strategic analyst on the conflict, Anthony Cordesman, says that the United States is losing the war against the Taliban. So, how did it come to this, and what does that mean? Well, what it means is the Taliban are said to control possibly over half of the country, half of Afghanistan. One should maybe qualify that and say that that's especially at night when government forces and NATO forces aren't around, especially also in less populated areas. The U.S. NATO project concentrates mostly on high population areas. So even in Kandahar, we're in Kandahar City and we're in Panjwai District and Zari District that are very densely populated farming areas. The rest, the other 14 or so districts are, scarcely see a soldier. And that's where the Taliban, tends to be in control. And they even set up administrations. They assign judges and people to adjudicate civil disputes, and we'll get to that in a bit. The Taliban in general, these people that seem to be ruling a large chunk of the country, are mostly locals. They're mostly Afghans. In the media you'll hear a lot about foreign Taliban. There are foreign Taliban. They're mostly Pakistani, and they're also Pashtun, like the majority of Afghan Taliban fighters. That is, they're from the basically this one region. Basically, there aren't many other foreign Taliban, despite what the media likes to talk about. There aren't many Arabs involved with them, and there aren't many Uzbeks, and there certainly aren't any Chechens. So they've, from the Taliban point of view, they've been succeeding, taking over chunks of Afghan territory, holding it for a while when they can. And they're actually gaining popular support. Well, why? Well, they've changed their ways. Everybody knows that when they were the government of Afghanistan in the 1990s, that they were, absolutely harsh and brutal. They're still that, but they're more predictable than the corrupt rule of the Afghan government that we're propping up. That's what people are saying. is what Afghan people are saying. So, for instance, Jean McKenzie is a journalist with the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. She's been running a journalism project in Afghanistan for several years. She's one of the best connected foreigners who are living in Afghanistan. And like I say, she's been training Afghan journalists for years, so she knows a lot of what's going on. And she wrote recently that in the literati of Kabul, the kind of people that foreigners like to hang around with, that are very pro-Western, of course, even in those circles in Kabul, they're talking about that the Taliban are being seen as a legitimate resistance movement. So they're getting more and more popular. They're gaining all sorts of popular support, believe it or not. Things have to be very bad, you'd think, for them to be turning back to the Taliban. So what is it that's so bad that's turning them to the Taliban? Well, in short, it's our occupation. 7 years on now. And no development, no stability, no security. Our occupation is there in support of a corrupt government composed of warlords and fundamentalists. Nothing to be proud of. So we have, ground troops all throughout the country, NATO and U.S. led, and then close air support, bombings, airstrikes. There's about 40 to 70 of those per day. You can see a short summary of them on the U.S. Air Force website every day. They tell you how many sorties they went on the day before, and they often tell you where they dropped bombs and this kind of thing. And that number has increased. It was on average about 40 a day a year ago. Now it's averaging around 70 a day. So that's why we've killed so many civilians so far this year, and there's no indication that's going to let up because the bombing runs have not stopped. So just turning back to public opinion then, I'll preface this with Canadian public opinion. Obviously, I'm sure everybody knows it's been pretty steady opposed to the war in Afghanistan. About 55% since shortly after Canadian soldiers were put into Kandahar in, if you recall, January of 2006, just after the current Conservative government came into power. Our soldiers ended up there. The decision was made beforehand by the Liberal government, but that's basically how long they've been doing the job that they're doing now. So along with a majority of Canadian public opinion opposed to our participation in the war, it's virtually the same throughout the first world countries that are involved there. Germany, Britain, even Australia now, the population there has turned against the war. Poland, much more so, 3/4 of the population. Like I mentioned, they've committed a massacre there, so their population is not really terribly happy about being there. And on it goes, Lithuania, you name it. Most countries, their populations are opposed to this. The United States is different. I think around 40, maybe less, say that they're opposed to the Afghan war. But surprisingly, and like I mentioned off the top, now there's very strong indications that Afghan public opinion has turned against the occupation. The Senless Council is a pro-war government or NGO, European-based. It's mostly its reason for being is the drug issue worldwide, but they happen to get involved in Afghanistan quite closely, and so they've produced a lot of the on-the-ground reports about what's going on in Afghanistan. And they've evidently done a poll, opinion survey, which they haven't released yet, but they did release a bit of the data earlier this summer, which indicates, or which says, according to them, over 60% of the Afghan population would like to see foreign troops out of the country. So notice it's even more so than Canadian public opinion. Now that wasn't the case a couple of years ago. That's changed. Before, Afghans were saying that they were patient. They were going to be patient to see how this occupation worked out, and now they've grown tired of it. And it's not only this opinion poll, plenty of informed Afghan opinion. Informed Afghan observers will note this. For instance, the editor-in-chief of a government-run newspaper in Kabul, he says that right now the majority of the Afghan population would be happy if foreign troops left the country. It's a government-run newspaper. So, and he's not the only one. Foreigners and Afghans have been noting this increasingly through this year, especially through this summer. So I think that is one pillar of an anti-war stance. That is, the people that are supposed benefits of our war and occupation there, they don't want it anymore. Another pillar would be the fact that it's illegal. I'll just briefly outline why it is that the war is illegal. There's two ways to fight a war legally. One is that you have to do it in self-defense. There's no time to ask the Security Council for permission. You have to do this in ongoing self-defense. It's an ongoing armed attack. In the case of the war in Afghanistan, what was a month between the 9/11 attacks, which sparked the war, and the onset of hostilities in Afghanistan? Nobody thinks that represents an ongoing attack. They were done with and finished by September 12th. Everybody knew that, the attacks on the U.S. So you can't call it self-defense. So the only other legal excuse you can have is if the Security Council said, yeah, do this. And a lot of people claim the Security Council did say go ahead and do that, but they're wrong. You can look at the Security Council resolutions that people claim founded the war and authorized the war, and you read the Security Council resolutions in question, and you notice that the word Afghanistan doesn't appear anywhere. Well, you can't authorize a war without actually authorizing who it's going to be against. So there was no UN resolution authorizing this, and George Bush famously didn't want it anyway. Pointedly, he wanted to tell the world that we aren't going to ask the UN for permission. He could have got it. Nobody thinks that he couldn't have got the other major players of the Security Council to agree to this. Everybody was, really on board the U.S. war from the beginning. So they could have got that, but pointedly they did not do that. And that helped pave the way for the Iraq War. I mean, there's consequences for this. You can't just, shred international law and expect that it won't have consequences, and they have, and they've had deadly consequences. So I think that's another pillar of an anti-war stance. And in fact, it could stand on its own. A person could just be opposed to the war simply because it's illegal, because no matter what benefits that war itself might bring to people, the danger posed because you're tearing up international law makes it simply not worth it. And I think that's a respectable anti-war position. But in this case, we have both. We have Afghan public opinion, Canadian public opinion, world public opinion practically, alongside the fact that it's an illegal war, and it's very dangerous to do that. One other note, people also claim it's a UN mission or UN mandated. The UN knows how to mandate a mission. They know the language to use in a resolution to indicate this is going to be a UN mission. All means necessary is one of the phrases that usually comes up in these things, and there's others. And you look at the documents that founded ISAF, the NATO ISAF project, and it simply doesn't have the language of a UN mission. People who say it is are simply being religious on the matter, I suppose. They're convinced without evidence. So to call it a UN mission is quite a stretch. The UN has gotten on board, and it has sort of subtly acquiesced, but to call it a UN mission is quite a stretch. So I think with time as it is, I think I'll just wrap up with just a brief discussion of what happens then if we pull out. Okay, the immediate flag comes up and you say, well, we should pull out because it's illegal and because it's not popular. But if we pull out, it'll get worse. There'll be a civil war is often what people say. We can't pull out now. We've got to protect them from each other. Sort of shades of Iraq there. And that argument just really doesn't hold water. If we think back to the 1980s when the Russians were occupying Afghanistan, everybody said, get out. Just get out. You have, as an occupier, you have no rights. You don't have a right to say, I'm going to stay and make sure that everything's cool before I pull out. You have no rights like that. You have only responsibilities. And in this case, our responsibility is to get out. Same as it was for the Russians, same as it should be for us. And speaking specifically to the issue of whether there will be a civil war, there might be a civil war. Many Afghans are saying that. Many Afghans are saying there will be a civil war after we pull out at the same time as they're saying we should pull out. Why? Because if we stay in there longer, the civil war will eventually come when we pull out. But the longer we stay, the worse that civil war will be. And again, that's exactly what people told the Russians. The Russians said, no, there'll be civil war if we pull out. And there was when they did. But the Russians said, no, we can't because there'll be civil war. And everybody else said, no, the longer you stay there, the worse the civil war will be. And so they stayed longer. And then the civil war that ensued was absolutely horrific. And it was so bad that the Taliban were welcomed by some people for their very stern but predictable justice. So what there should be is a peace process that involves all regional players. Afghanistan is a highly strategic place, so it has a lot of regional concerns that center on it. And so Pakistan and Iran, Russia even, India, all of them have concerns about this, about what goes on there, and they're all going to have to come up with an arrangement where they can make sure that nobody else is, or so that they're not going to keep siding with one side or another in civil war. So, yeah, I think our position should be troops out now, sort of much like the rally that's going on next weekend. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on.
Okay, thanks, Dave.